Back in the 70s, board games and improv theater had a baby, and it was called the role-playing game. These games allowed a generation of kids to live out their dreams of slaying dragons and saving kingdoms, all while sitting in their bedrooms and basements. Today, gaming has moved into the cultural mainstream, and role-playing games are back with a vengeance. Join us now as 5 of these former kids come out of the basement and onto the internet to experience adventure, mystery, and obscure pop culture references. It's time for Roll for Combat!
Hey everyone, welcome to a special edition of Roll for Combat. I'm your GM and host, Stephen Glicker, and in this special edition, I'm sitting down and interviewing the Pathfinder Creative Director, James Jacobs. James has been around over 30 years. He has been involved in the world of D&D and Pathfinder, and we sit down and talk about a whole bunch of topics. Of course, we talk about the new Pathfinder Adventure Path, Return the Runelords. We also touch on a whole bunch of things throughout his career. We discuss the creation of the Adventure Path concept, which he helped originate at Dungeon Magazine. We talk about his work on Age of Worms, The Red Hand of Doom, Expedition to the Ruins of Greyhawk, Burnt Offerings, what to expect on the upcoming Adventure Path to Tyrant's Grasp, and a little bit about the first Adventure Path for Pathfinder version 2. We talk about a whole bunch of things, as you guys can see. So this is actually the first episode of year 2 of the Roll for Combat podcast, and I wanted to treat you guys with something special. So sit back and relax and enjoy my interview with James Jacobs. So this is Stephen Glicker from Roll for Combat, and I have James Jacobs, the creative director for Pathfinder from Paizo, who is also going to be talking about Return of the Runelords and all things Adventure Path with me here today. Hello, James.
Hey there, how's it going? Good to be on.
Yes. I've actually wanted to have you on for a long time because you have been around for quite a while. Isn't it true that you actually got published at the ripe old age of 16, your very first adventure?
Yeah, it was 16, 15, something like that. It kind of blurs together because when I started, it was back in the Dungeon Magazine issue 12 that I got my first published credit. And I started, I guess, a year before, and it's such a long turnaround from writing to publication. So I think I was 15 when I started writing and 16 when it was published.
So your name is just everywhere. It's one of those names everyone sees James Jacobs all over the place from the very beginning of D&D all the way up to now, the end of Pathfinder version 1 and starting with Pathfinder version 2.
Yep, been around for a while, that's for sure.
So before we get into Return of the Runelords, I just wanted to ask, what is your role as the creative director of Pathfinder exactly?
So it's basically the guy in charge of the fiction part of it. So we've got the design team, which is led by Jason Bullman, and they're in charge of all of like the rules and the mechanics of the game and all that. But the creative direction side of things is more focused on the world side of things. So I will be approving all of the book outlines that people produce. I'll be working with the design team to make sure that the rules are working with the world that we've got. I do a lot of the high concept by creating a lot of like the content of the world, working with Eric Mona a lot as our chief creative officer, and our development team to just basically shepherd all of the flavorful content that we put into Galarian and all of our products.
One thing I wanted to talk about is obviously we're going to be talking about Adventure Paths and Return of the Runelords, but from what I understand, at your time at Dungeon Magazine, you were one of the people who came up with the concept of Adventure Paths in general. And can you talk about how that came about?
Yeah, that was, I think it was Chris Youngs who actually came up with the initial idea to do basically a serialized first level to 20th level campaign in Dungeon. And I had by that point been writing quite frequently, doing stuff with other editors like Chris Perkins and So they came to me and talked to me about they were doing this big, Shackled City, a whole series of linked adventures, and asked me if I wanted to pitch in. And of course I did. So at that point, it really wasn't super organized. It was a case of like Chris Perkins wrote the first adventure, and then they gave me that adventure and I read it. And then I basically did sort of an Exquisite Corpse type thing where I wrote the next adventure. And then I gave that to, I think it was Dave Noonan wrote the next adventure. And it kind of evolved organically along the way. And we learned a lot about that. I came on, was hired onto Paizo pretty much right after I finished my first adventure for Shackled City. So I was there not quite from the start of it, but from basically part 2 on.
So yeah, because Shackled City is the first quote official adventure path, and I remember because Dungeon Magazine is like one of my favorite magazines of all time, and I was physically upset when it was canceled. I love that magazine so much. But the one I talk about all the time is the second adventure path, Age of Worms, which I say over and over again that was the greatest adventure path to date by far. Nothing has even come close. Just because the sheer insanity of Age of Worms, and I'm going to say we can spoil it because it's like 12, 13 years old. So I'm going to say the statute of limitations is over. We can talk a little bit about it, but you do insane things in that. I mean, you actually find a rod of 7 parts. You fight doppelgangers. You go to the city of Greyhawk. You hang out with Tensor. You find a hand of Vecna. You fight Dragotha, you fight a god. I mean, it's like, okay, oh, you want to do something really cool? Like get cloned or become, get taken over by a doppelganger? Yeah, we have that in here. Like every cool thing ever in the history of D&D was in this adventure path.
Yeah, that's really side effect. Eric Mona was the one that initially wrote the outline for Age of Worms, and the initial very, very first concept was that it was going to be a 20-part adventure path with 1 adventure per level. And it was like there was all these dungeons and stuff in there. And we sent that over to Wizards of the Coast for approval. And they actually gave us some really good advice where it's like, we don't want to do that. People, they figured we'll get tired if it went on for, almost 2 years. So they suggested we, tone it back to a year-long adventure path, focus mostly on multiple levels so that we don't do 1 per. And the end result, I think, speaks for itself. It was really fun to work on. It was the first one that we ever actually built an outline from start to finish. And so we were able to seed in a lot of like foreshadowing and anticipation type stuff. We were able to pace it out a lot better than Shackled City. We learned a lot with Shackled City and put all that to the test really in Age of Worms.
Yeah, and in Age of Worms, not only that, you have the craziest writers on this. You have Eric Mona, Mike Merles, Sean K. Reynolds, Jason Bowman, Richard Pete, who wrote 2, and that's insane alone because he's nuts. Greg Vaughn, Tito. I mean, it's like a who's who. Everyone who wrote one of these. It's just nuts.
Yeah, we Dungeon at the time was the only place that was really doing a lot of adventures for D&D, and so we got a lot of people. We had a really good, strong relationship with Wizards of the Coast at the time, and a lot of us who worked at Paizo there had worked at Wizards of the Coast as well. So we were able to get a lot of people excited about it, and it was a really cool mix of like people who've been around for a while, and back at that point, like Greg Vaughn and Richard Pett and Tito, they were pretty new writers, and so they were just getting their start on the thing. So it was like it was a good mix of the old and the new at the time, and now they're all old. So it's like you said, 12 years ago.
So you wrote adventure number 11, Into the Wormcrawl Fissure, and I want to talk about it only because you have perhaps the most epic fight I've ever seen ever. That you fight Dragotha, a CR27 red dragon Dracolich, not a Dracolich, the Dracolich, who was the consort to Tiamat. And that is just the craziest fight I've ever seen.
One of the really fun things about working on Dungeon Magazine was that we got to play with all of the legacy of Dungeons and Dragons. And especially for something like the long-term format of campaigns for Shackled City, Savage Tide, and Age of Worms, we really got to dive into a lot of the history of all of that. And like Dragotha was just a little drawing up in the corner on the map of White Plume Mountain, and there really wasn't a lot more about him. So it was always something that I had personally been just fascinated by, combined with the Wormcrawl Fissure, which didn't have much about it back in, I think, one of the earlier Greyhawk campaign settings. So it was just a chance for me for that case of diving in and doing something, giving back to D&D some of the excitement and wonder that it gave to me when I was growing up a gamer.
And yeah, I mean, you get to fight. It's like the ultimate dragon. And then the treasure hoard is the biggest treasure hoard I've ever seen. It's an entire page. I'm looking at it now. It's 2,500,000 copper pieces, 360,000 silver, 48,000 gold, 2,500 platinum. It's like, oh yeah, 50 masterwork weapons, 20 masterwork suits, plus 5 ghost touch chain shirt, adamantium this, adamantium that. It's just ridiculous.
There's like artifacts in there, and like that was a really fun treasure hoard just to make, because I figured that if you were killing Dragotha, one of the most famous dragons in the game, that you should feel like getting the treasure from this dragon is memorable. And that's one of the things that I really try to do a lot with significant treasure hoards like the Dragothas is put a lot of detail into it, so that it's as much fun looking at the loot as it is fighting the guy that is guarding it.
Yeah, I mean, you even write that. It's like, Dragotha's been around for 2,500 years and is a level 27 dragon, so he's going to have the biggest treasure hoard ever.
Yeah. I wasn't really worried at that point about breaking the economy of the game, because it's already at the very end of the campaign. There's not a lot more to do in the future. So
yeah, that was just it's just everything about this. It's like everything you fight, even getting up to Dragotha, their stats are a page long. Like the Lich you fight, he's got a page just of spells alone.
Yeah, those definitely those old stat blocks got pretty enormous. Like the very last adventure, Caius's stat block, I think, was like 3 pages long, if I remember. Igwil's was pretty immense in Savage Tide. To a certain extent, it's fun building those giant stat blocks, because it just feels epic. It feels like a significant, addition to the game. But it's also a case of once you get to that character and you're running it, it can be pretty overwhelming to run them. And I think a lot of GMs get nervous about, not doing them justice or not using everything that they present. And when it really comes down to it, a lot of combats are only going to last for like 3 or 4 rounds. So a GM shouldn't be too worried about making sure that the monster gets to use every single one of its abilities. Just pick and choose the ones that you think are going to be the most fun for your game, and it'll work.
Yeah, I always remember that one, because it kept getting. What I liked about Age of Worms is not only do you get to do like everything you've ever wanted to do in history in D&D, but you just keep fighting every epic creature ever in the game, and then it just keeps going. And then you start fighting the legendary creatures, and then you fight gods. It's like, okay, it just never stops. It keeps ramping it up. It goes to 11, if you will.
Oh, yeah. We kept trying to get the Tarrasque in there too, and we never really figured out how to put him in there. I tried again in Savage Tide. I've been trying to get the Tarrasque into an adventure path pretty much the entire time, and he's just a tricky guy to finagle.
Return of the Runelords, you got plenty of opportunity. We might, right? Maybe?
Yeah, sort of. I mean, by this, one of the things going on with Return of the Runelords is that it's very much something that we've built over the last decade. And as I've continued working on Pathfinder and all of that, I kind of, scratched my D&D legacy itch back in the dungeon days. And right now I'm really interested in putting a lot of the stuff that we've done into the adventures and all of that. We certainly have the Tarrasque in our world, but there's other creatures in there they're just as enormous, just as legendary at this point, because they've been around for 10 years or so. And so there's certainly, I don't want to get too spoilery about Return of the Runelords, but the Oliphant of Jandalay is on the cover of the last volume. So that's kind of its own spoiler in and of itself, which is one of our big, bad, enormous, gargantuan end of the world monsters.
So I do want to talk about that, but I do want to talk about a few more, because my friends would kill me if I didn't get the chance to talk about these.
Fair enough.
Well, we have Expedition to the Ruins of Greyhawk, which is also one of the most loved adventures of all time. And you wrote that with Jason Bowman and Eric Mona. So you three writing a Expedition to the Ruins of Greyhawk. What was that like? Because that sounds like a party all the time.
It was pretty awesome. I mean, there's a few things that I could point to as being like the culmination of everything I wanted to do for Dungeons and Dragons, and that is certainly one of them. Working on Mori Castle for Dungeon 112 was another one that comes to mind. But for Expedition of the Ruins of Greyhawk, By that point, Wizards of the Coast already knew that we at Paizo, Eric and Jason and I, were huge Greyhawk fans, probably bigger fans of Greyhawk, more knowledgeable about Greyhawk than anyone at Wizards of the Coast at the time. And so they'd already done a couple of the other return to hardcover adventures, and they came to us and offered us the chance to work on this one. And we, of course, we jumped on it and kind of sat down and split up who would be doing what, started working on a plot line. And they really kind of gave us, blank check to do whatever we wanted with the plot line. So we were able to weave in a bunch of like Easter eggs to the adventure paths we did in Dungeon, bring in a bunch of just stuff from all over the place, and really do the best we could to, honor the tradition, because it's like the original Dungeon. We didn't want to mess it up.
And you just actually mentioned Moray's Castle. And
yeah,
that's considered like the very first mega dungeon. So you just only helped invent adventure paths and mega dungeons, because I forgot that you worked on that too. And that's classic. And that's a fantastic dungeon.
Yeah, Moray Castle is one of my favorite. The old Mordenkainen's Fantastic Adventure it's a really relatively short adventure. It's just basically a dungeon crawled through 3 levels, and it was just so much imagination in there that Rob Kuntz put in when he was writing it, and it's always inspired me. I've run it like 3 or 4 times, and every time it's been a blast running it. So a lot of the Dungeon magazine stuff and working with Wizards of the Coast was just a great chance for me to take all of the stuff that inspired me, when I was just starting to play D&D and getting into the industry and all that, and kind of expand on it and give back and hopefully inspire a bunch of new people to, keep going with it. So.
And then that castle, you kept adding more levels, because I know, as soon as so funny, you say issue 112, which I literally have on my bookshelf next to me, because that was like one of the big issues. There was a lot in that issue. And then you guys just kept adding more and more levels. And those levels are really dense. There's a lot, and they're hard. There's a lot of craziness that goes on in that castle. I think you even have a disclaimer saying like, oh yeah, you can easily die. Like, this is a very hard adventure, and if I remember correctly.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And we had eventually wanted to do basically the entire dungeon. We had all these levels planned out, and the idea was that every time we launched an adventure path, we get Rob to write a new level, and then we put that in there. And so we've got one at the start of Age of Worms, we got one at the start of Savage Tide, and then of course 4th edition came along, and we went into Pathfinder. So that's kind of we got 3 levels in, or yeah, 3. We got one new level in the first one, and then a couple others. So it's pretty good stuff.
And then finally, I know a lot of my friends call Red Hand of Doom, which you wrote with Richard Baker, their favorite adventure of all time. I know a lot of people think that that's an excellent adventure. So, and in fact, it's been noted like a lot of the best of lists. They always talk about it. So what made that one what made that one work that people like it so much?
That's a good question. I think part of it was the sheer size of the adventure at the time. Wizards wasn't really doing any big adventures, and that one came out, and it was meaty. It was huge. It was significant. It was its own campaigns, and it had its own setting and everything. Rich came up with the overall plot for the entire thing, and he was originally going to write the whole adventure, and then he got pulled off onto doing some other emergency design work at Wizards, and they hired me to basically come in and write the remainder of the adventure. I picked up Rich's notes, which covered from the start of the adventure up through, I think, the Hydra, if I remember correctly, in the swamp in the first section of the game. And then I basically filled out the rest of the 70-80% of the last of the adventure, building off of his rough notes and like design goals of like introducing new types of dragons, having something to do with Tiamat. Spoiler alert, there's something to do with Tiamat in this one. And basically just trying to build up a big epic adventure. So I think it's just a case of everything hitting at the right place at the right time.
Yeah, I know a lot of people. I think a big part of it is because it is a 128-page adventure. And at the time, they're like, just adventures just weren't that big. If you look back at the old first edition D&D adventures, people like fondly remember them. They're like so little. There's like nothing in them.
The thing to remember with those first edition adventures is that was all there was for D&D to buy. You had the Dungeon Master's Guide, you had the Player's Handbook, and the Monster Manual. And it was years before they started doing anything other than hardcover monster books. And the only thing really that came out for the game were the adventures. They created sort of a shared experience so that everybody, played caves, went through the Caves of Chaos, or explored White Plume Mountain, or died in the Tomb of Horrors, and people were able to go to conventions and have this shared experience, be able to talk about it. And I think that adventures are, you can make the rules of the game as exciting, or not exciting, but as with as many options and choices for your characters as you want, but without a story to use those choices in, it doesn't really do much. The adventures are where you build the memories and have the the stories of the game. So I think that adventures are fundamentally important to the long-term health of any role-playing game.
Yeah, it's funny because everyone, even to this day, we still talk about like White Plume Mountain. Like everyone's done White Plume Mountain and how they get past like the last part and Black Razor. And I mean, it's just, it's all this shared experience. Like you said, everyone has a common language that they can talk about.
Oh, absolutely. And it's that adventures not only give this common language, but they inspire you. I mean, you see something that happens in an adventure, be it something that another writer has written or something that rises organically from play. And the entire concept of the nation of Thassalon is basically the result of a TPK in a game of White Plume Mountain that I ran back in college.
Something else I wanted to touch on real quick. You also helped write two of my favorite Pathfinder books because we ran Iron Gods. So you wrote the technology guide, and then you also wrote a Numeria guide as well.
Yeah, that was something that I've been wanting to get off let me back up a little bit. Iron Gods was one of the very first adventure paths I wanted to work on. I even had the title like way back during when I was working on Burnt Offerings. I had like a little spreadsheet of all of these different ideas, and Iron Gods and I think Jade Regent were the only two that I had actual names or locked in from the very start. And so it took forever to get there because in order to make Iron Gods work, we needed to have all these rules for technology and everything. And a lot of the basic rules for like how lasers work and how all of these technological items interact with the fantasy setting and everything was something that I've been working on for years already with this sort of homebrew post-apocalyptic game that I've been building and running and rebuilding and running and rebuilding and running. And so I already had my headspace in that whole area of how science fiction and fantasy kind of intersect and interact. So I was able to basically build pretty much all of the technology guy with some help in there from Russ doing a bunch of the back stuff with like artifacts and super powerful stuff.
When Iron Gods was announced, I wouldn't say we're bored of adventures or like fantasy, but we were bored of fantasy. It's like every time you do fantasy adventures, it's the same thing. You always get like cloak of protection. You always get the same gear. And when you've been playing for 30 plus years, it does get a little rote. And then as soon as Iron Gods, it's like everything was different. It was like nothing worked the same way. It was almost a new system in a weird way when we played.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the things that I was excited to explore was just how this new concept of how technology works and all that. And it's one thing that we really try to do with our adventure paths is we do 2 of them a year, and you can't really play 2 of them in a year unless that's all you do. So we basically will do one that's sort of like a safe fantasy type option. Then the next one will be something more experimental, whether it's like, Iron Gods, or it's all pirate ship, which is kind of experimental, or it's a lot of like, or you're playing evil characters or stuff like that. And we do try to mix it up so that you don't have that standard fantasy experience every single time. But at the same point, that is the most popular type of game to play. So we've constantly got new people joining and coming to the system and all that. So we want to make sure that they always have something to go back to.
But even this was sort of like almost a jumping off point for Starfinder, because when Iron Gods was announced, we played it and we just loved it. We loved having technology in our fantasy. It's like science fiction in our fantasy. It was so much fun. It just was all new. It was like a big breath of fresh air. And just even fighting those type of monsters, everything was new again. And then you see a lot of what was seen in the technology guide in Starfinder. So was that intentional, or was that just sort of a happy coincidence?
I think it's probably a little bit of both. I've done very little direct work on on Starfinder. I drew the map for Absalom Station, and I've statted up, I think, 3 monsters in Alien Archive 2, and that's the sum total of my design work and input really on Starfinder. It's pretty much handled by an entirely separate team. But when they were building it, they definitely were looking at Iron Gods and all of the technology rules and items in there, and drew. I mean, it's stuff we already own. It's stuff our customers and gamers were already familiar with and enjoyed. So it made sense to build off of that content when they were building up Starfinder.
So who also made Numerian Fluid? I'm just curious. Did you write that one or?
The original idea for like these barbarians getting drunk on these like stuff leaking out of spaceships, I think was Eric Mona's idea, but the actual rules for how they work, one of the weird things about the development of an adventure is when you go in and develop somebody else's words, and what you're doing is you're not only going through making sure the rules work, you're going through and making sure that the language works. So it's kind of a rules pass and an editorial pass at the same time. But you're also going through to make sure that it's fun to read, that it's interesting, that it ties in with the whole world that it's set in. And when I develop an adventure or a product like that, it'll either be something as light as just an editorial pass that takes a few days to do, or it could end up being an entire rewrite of everything that takes weeks to do. And it ends up with a lot of the stuff that I've written is, from me rather than from the author. And we don't really keep track of who does what in that. So I developed the Numerian Fluids. I'm pretty sure that I wrote a lot of them, but it's hard to remember exactly how much was from the original author or what.
Oh, I'm fine with that. I just give you a quick story that I've mentioned before in the show, but Jason McDonald, who plays Tuttle on our show, when we played Iron Gods, he played a barbarian, and it was modeled kind of after Worf on Star Trek. And he had a ritual that every time he leveled, he drank the Numerian Fluid. And it is a crazy table where you roll 1 to 100. 1 being you disintegrate and cannot be resurrected in any way, shape, or form. 100, if you remember, 100 is so good that you roll a sub-table of 1 to 10. And being 1, you become, or is it 10? You are a immortal god, basically. So it can go anywhere from becoming immortal to disintegrating. When he was playing, one time he rolled a 2, which is
wow.
Yeah, not good. So he rolls the 2, and he luckily, that's where you lose one of your senses forever. He loses the sense of taste, which I won't get into. Ended up being a very good thing because he kept getting invited to like eating contests and drinking contests, and he would always win because he had no sense of taste anymore. So it actually came in handy. And then the next time he rolled a 100. And then on the sub table, he rolled a 2. A 2 is where you get the mutant template. And he was already a war priest of Gorum. And he ended up with a 26 strength. And by that, we just kept calling him Bane because he basically was Bane at that point.
Nice.
So he saw everything from the lows to the highs and everything in between. But it's still, to this date, we still talk about it. It was one of the most memorable things ever.
That's one of the things. And it's interesting that you mentioned how memorable it is. One of my personal theories about the game is the parts that are the most memorable are when the rules get basically kind of thrown out the window to a certain extent, The Numerian Fluids design was one of the early inspirations was back in first edition. They had this potion miscibility table. I don't know if you remember that or whenever if in first edition you drank a potion and its effects were still going and you drank a second potion, you had to roll on this table to see how these potions mixed together inside of you, and they could blow up, they could become permanent. There's all sorts of different things they could do. I remember at one point there was one adventure that I was playing in where another player was like falling out of like a skyship or something, and he was desperate, so he drank a potion of fly and then a potion of I think healing because he was almost dead, and he didn't know about this table and had to roll on it and somehow avoided exploding and making it all the way to the ground. But that always stuck in my head as fun. And so something like the Numerian Fluids table, kind of, it's like the deck of many things, or the Harrow, type element where it's completely random what will happen to you. And it's kind of like gambling to a certain extent, I guess, where you're gambling with your character's future. And even when something bad happens, like you lose your sense of taste, that ends up being a huge part of, the fun of the game. So I think it's really important for those types of Wahoo type out of the ordinary moments to show up in adventures.
Yeah, we actually on our podcast we have a lot of random tables, and they've actually been written by a lot of the Paizo employees. For example, we have this thing called the Stitch Spider, which was written by Jason Keeley. It's sort of like a wand, and it'll heal you, except it's poison, so you have to roll a very high fort save, and if you don't make it, there's some horrific side effects to the venom that heals you. So you get healed, but then you grow like plates for a few days, or you get healed but you have hair all over you, things like that. It's not horrible, but there's side effects. John Compton made Cheddar, which is the robot companion for Tuttle, which is half robot, half goblin, and he has all these goblin tables that it can either do really good things or explode, stuff like that. So we have tons of random tables created for our venture, and we're always rolling on them, and even we don't know what happened. I made these goblin grenades, and if you threw them and rolled this like a 1 to a 5, it actually healed the monster. And in a fight, Hiroji threw the goblin grenade and rolled a 2 and a 4, and then he ended up overhealing the monsters. And we still make fun of him to this day. It's the first time ever in combat that someone healed more damage than they did when they were trying to fight.
Excellent. Those random tables they're kind of like their own mini games in a way. Whether you're rolling them during play or you're rolling them when you're building an adventure. That's kind of how like the old random treasure generator tables worked, and we put some of those into Game Master Guide and the Ultimate Equipment. It's fun to do that. When you're writing an adventure, you're doing a lot of creativity and a lot of decision making and all that, and it's kind of therapeutic to basically turn things over to the dice and roll things up.
Yeah, and this way also it just makes things random for everyone, and it's like choose your own adventure, but picking random pages, because no one knows, not even the GM. It's like usually it's the GM, you pretty much have control of everything. This is like the only time, except when you're doing combat, where you have no idea what's going to happen, and the PCs, no one knows, and then you have to change the story based on what comes up.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the ad lib moments, that arise from rolling those types of random tables, and it's on par with like a player character rolling a natural 1 or a 20, and it's like suddenly shifting the course of a combat dramatically over what was going to happen. And cases like that, I love as a GM, because it gives you something to like latch onto and build memorable scenes out of.
So let's jump to Return of the Runelords. So this is one of the last 2 adventure paths that are coming out for Pathfinder version 1. And it sounds like you are going with the Age of Worms, Eric Mona School of Thought, because you guys are going out with a bang. Because the last 2 adventure paths sound like they're going all out insane, which is fun. But with Return of the Runelords, can you tell me a little bit about what makes this so special? Who are the Runelords? If no one has ever done Rise of the Runelords or Shattered Star, like, can you tell me a little bit about this whole history?
Yeah, absolutely. So it goes back to the very first adventure path we did for Pathfinder, Rise of the Runelords. And when we started that adventure path with Burnt Offerings, we were not only starting a brand new adventure path, we were starting a brand new world. We didn't have any proper nouns, So we had to make up all of the stuff, Varisia, Runelords, Sandpoint, all of these things had to be basically introduced to players, out of the blue. And you had to learn about them while you were, playing the game. So we really wanted to go with something that was kind of classic, a small town with the bad evil wizard is the main bad guy for the entire adventure path. And then also build in a lot of history to everything so that we had places to build from. So the Runelords are basically this ancient caste of wizards who ruled this ancient realm 10,000 years in the past called Thassalon. And there were 7 of them. Each of the Runelords was associated with one of the 7 deadly sins. They each specialized in a different form of magic, and they all had like their own special pole arms and their own special swords and their own special like outfits and everything. And we seeded a lot of that stuff into that first adventure, but then focused most of that adventure path on one Runelord, Karzug, who was the Runelord of Greed. And by the time you finished that first adventure path, you'd not only been introduced to the world of Galarian, but you'd also been introduced to this, this ancient sect of wizards who was out there, and you defeated one of them, but there was always this like lingering threat that there are still 6 more out there potentially ready to wake up and wreak havoc. And then several years pass, and we do a sequel to this one called Shattered Star. And the idea there was we wanted to basically just do a full-on dungeon crawl adventure path where you go out and gather the artifacts and build things together and basically make it a super simple, just classic play experience. And we decided to attach that to the Runelords storyline and built more into it. The plan always was to eventually have sort of a trilogy out of all of this, with the last adventure path covering all of the other Runelords waking up and starting to, run amok in the world. But we couldn't really do that until people knew what they were, what they were. We had to earn the right to get that crazy, that wild. When we did Age of Worms, we had already like 15, 20 years or something of D&D's history with characters like Tensor and Caius and Dragotha and all of these characters that we could pull out of the woodwork and throw into, on screen. We couldn't do that when we first started with Pathfinder, but now that we're wrapping up the first edition, we can go in and just get really crazy with a lot of these lingering threats we've been talking about all this time.
So what is the general story? I don't want to do too many spoilers since probably a lot of people are going to want to play it or run it. So can you give me like the general overview of Return of the Runelords? And then obviously the first one we're talking about is Secrets of Roderick's Cove.
Sure. I'll try to do this without as many spoilers as possible. Basically, the campaign starts in the small town of Roderic's Cove, which is up on the north coast of Varisia's Lost Coast region. It basically begins with all of the Runelords have these weapons called the Swords of Sin, and each one of these swords is associated with one of these sins and types of magic, and they would give these swords to their champions, their bodyguards. And once the Runelords, got killed or went into hiding or all that, their Swords of Sin went dormant. They lost most of their powers. So with Return of the Runelords, one of these swords suddenly wakes up. And the only reason it would do that, of course, is because one of the Runelords wakes up. And this sets into motion a chain of events. The PCs get a hold of the sword. They start seeing like other bits of evidence that the Runelords are waking up. Thessalonian magic is starting to seep up out of the ground, and literally in a couple of places, influencing town like gang members. They're starting to use these old runes as their gang signs. There's these weird monsters climbing up out of the ground. So it's really the first adventure, Secrets of Roderick's Cove, is kind of a sandbox where the player characters are kind of exploring the town, going around to like these haunted houses and like cave systems and dungeons scattered throughout the area, and piecing together stuff that's going on until they realize that there's definitely something happening. The Runelords are waking up, and at that point, they need to go figure out what to do with all of this, this evil magic that's coming back, and try to work with previous heroes from the previous adventure paths and move forward to basically save the world.
So what happened to the original Runelords? So there were 7 of them, and then they, quote, went to sleep? What happened?
So Thassalon, the nation they ruled, was around for I think it was almost 2,000 years. And a couple of the Runelords, Runelord Xandergul and Runelord Sorshan, basically were the rulers of their separate nations for the entire 2,000 some years. But the other 5 categories have had multiple Runelords. I think in all there's been 49 Runelords. And we go into all of this in the first volume of Return of the Runelords, has a timeline for everything. But there were only ever really 7 at a time. So by the time things were getting basically at the height of Thassalon, and all of these Runelords were getting really powerful, this world-ending event called Earthfall happened. And Earthfall was basically these underwater monsters, the Aboleths, the Veiled Masters, decided that they wanted to basically wipe humanity clean and start over. And they called down all of these meteors out of the sky and basically caused this apocalypse that didn't quite end the world as well as they had hoped, but it did bring about the end of Thassalon. And the Runelords, of course, being powerful wizards, saw this whole event coming through, divination or, omens or stuff like that. And so they all have these separate methods of how they went into hiding or into these demi-planes or into suspended animation or became liches so they could resurrect after they die. And they each had their different method of immortality mixed with how to avoid the end of the world. But the end of the world was something that was even bigger than they thought, and Earthfall messed everything up. And they basically went into hibernation, more or less, for the next 10,000 years. And for most of that time, they've been just off screen. And it's kind of the launch of Pathfinder is basically the launch of their return to activity. I hope that is sort of a rambling answer to that question.
No, that was a very good answer. And what makes these Runelords so bad? Why don't we want them to rise? Why not have them return? They sound like okay guys.
Well, they basically epitomize the 7 worst aspects of rulers. And by tying it to the 7 classic deadly sins, we have things like there's Karzug, who's the Runelord of Greed, and he's basically going to do everything he can to amass all of the wealth in the world for himself. There's Elasnist, who's the Runelord of Wrath, and she just wants to see the world burn. There's Xandergold, who's the Runelord of Pride, and he wants everything focused on him and doesn't think anyone else deserves any attention at all. And so you've got these powerful personalities combined with just insane power. They're all like high-level wizards, so they've got all of these abilities to use wishes and powerful magic. And basically, the reason you don't want them back is because they're kind of like the archetypical bad guys. You don't want them in charge of where you're living because it's going to be awful living there.
Couldn't the gods just like come down and just strike them dead, or even the gods scared of these guys?
Oh, the gods could, but if they did, then we wouldn't have a game.
Oh, there you go. So the real world answer. So,
yeah, I mean, that's actually something that we really tried to do with Galarian is we don't have the gods coming in and doing interventions. We don't have even high-level good guy NPCs all over the place because we want the player characters to be the ones to come in and save the land, save the world. And if there's this idea that the gods can come in and just right every wrong, there's no need for heroes. There's no game going on, and it's not fun. That may be good for fiction where you have control over everything, but it's not so great for like a game where you want to have like a bunch of people playing characters and acting things out. In world, we go into this exact topic in Planar Adventures a little bit, but the basic idea is that if a god comes down to right or wrong or change something, there's nothing humans and mortals can do about it because they're just, mortals. But then other gods are going to see that and come in and change things. And it'll start this kind of divine arms race where each deity comes in and undoes the previous deity's act of God. And it only would culminate in basically everything getting destroyed because, there's no check or balances in that thing. And the gods understand this. So that's why they kind of moderate themselves and let humanity, let their worshipers, let those who follow their words do their work on the world.
Otherwise, it becomes like Clash of the Titans. And I don't mean the horrible remakes. I mean the original 1981 version where they keep exactly what happens. They keep one-upping each other. And then before you know it, like the gods are just, all their mythic creatures are all getting killed because they're killing each other off. And yeah, I could see how that all happens.
Yeah, and it doesn't make for fun play when if you have a bunch of people sitting around the table and they want to do, dungeon exploration or role playing or whatever, and the GM is basically telling them this NPC comes in and does this or this god does that. That's not role playing. That's a bunch of people sitting around. That's storytelling, and that's an entirely different sort of shared experience. It's not what a game is trying to do, though.
So, Return of the Runelords. The other thing I noticed is that these adventures are huge. Like I usually read these. It seems like the word count's up on these because the pictures are tiny. There's a lot of words, and this is like, quote, the biggest adventure you've ever written or run for Pathfinder or for the Adventure Path line?
Yeah, it absolutely is. One of the things that I've wanted to do for a long time is to do an adventure path that goes from first level to 20th level. And with a 6-volume adventure that is locked in at 45, 50 pages, it's just the laws of physics don't allow you to put in enough encounters to go from first to 20th level. It doesn't work. And so in order to be able to do this, we were able to go to 20th level with Wrath of the Righteous because Mythic allows us to throw super powerful encounters and bloat the experience points out. But that wasn't even satisfactory to me. I wanted one that was just pure first to 20th level. The only way to do that is to write longer adventures. And so for this one, we've removed the forward from the adventure path. We've removed one of the support articles. So right off the bat, every adventure becomes 8 pages longer. The last adventure, we've removed 2 of the back matter articles. And so the last adventure for Return of the Runelords is the longest adventure we've ever published in the Adventure Path format. And even then, we were barely able to get to 20th level in time for you to enjoy your characters doing 20th level shenanigans in the last set of encounter areas. But yeah, they're definitely enormous adventures, that's for sure.
Yeah, because I was reading the first one, and I was like, oh, it goes from level 1 to 5, and that's only the first adventure. That is a big adventure.
Yeah, we've managed to get to 5th level a couple of times before. First level, lower level adventures have shorter stat blocks. You don't have to spend as much time, covering corner cases and everything. So they get a lot more bang for their buck in there. But when you get to high level, you got to start thinking of things like if you throw a dead body into a dungeon room, you got to keep in mind that the player characters might cast Speak with Dead or even resurrect that body, and you have to remember that might be a place for you to talk about more repercussions. You have to talk about how flight and teleportation and resurrection and all this stuff impacts the game. As player characters get more options, you have to get more detailed, and that means adventures take up more room.
So one thing I did want to touch on is that I almost forgot, you wrote the very first Adventure Path volume ever. You wrote Burnt Offerings for Rise of the Runelords. Like, how did that come about? Because you basically were the person who architect Pathfinder for the next 10 plus years because you wrote the very first adventure.
It was kind of, to a certain extent, it was being in the right place at the right time. I had been working on Dungeon at that point from basically as an editor from issue, I think, 103 to 150. So I had a lot of experience in developing adventures. I've been writing adventures even longer than that. And it just, in a lot of ways, Pathfinder is the spiritual successor to Dungeon Magazine. It's Adventure Paths. It's a series of adventures with support material. And I had in my head a pretty strong idea of how such a product would work, and Eric Mona did as well, having been the other half of Dungeon Magazine for that entire time. And so, with Eric basically running the publisher side of things, he didn't really have time to do much of the writing or developing of all this stuff. So that basically fell to me to do that, with Wes Schneider coming along to help out with a lot of the development, the back end of things. So yeah, it was kind of sort of basically still doing what we'd been doing for several years with Dungeon, but having a new format and being able to try new types of stuff out for our own.
So is there anything we could talk about that isn't spoilery? I know there's some time travel of some sort. They've mentioned that many times, so I'm not going to say that's spoilery, but there's some crazy stuff that you've always wanted to do that you've never been able to do, but I know you figured out how to get into Return of the Runelords.
Yeah, absolutely. There's, like you said, there's a time travel element that happens in this one. And time travel is a tricky thing for a campaign setting like this, because we can't just set an entire adventure path back in, say, the ancient land of Thassalon. You go back that far, and there are some gods who don't exist yet because they haven't, been born yet. So suddenly, several of the deities that clerics can pick from aren't available. You go back that far, and there are certain races that don't exist yet. Like in Thassalon, the dwarves were still deep underground, and as a result, there were, people didn't really know about dwarves in Thassalon. So there's just a lot of assumptions that the core game makes that go out the window if you go back that far. And on top of that, you get in this whole element of like paradox type stuff, where somebody back in time that far is like, well, I know that Earthfall is going to happen. I'm going to stop it from happening. And suddenly they do something that basically makes the entire 10 years of products you've been publishing, outdated. They no longer function. So we really don't want to, unless a game is specifically about time travel and changing the flow of time and all of that, it's not really something that I think can work well in a role-playing game. In Return of the Runelords, the time travel elements is pretty restricted. It without getting into spoilers too much, the actual point at which the player characters are time traveling is locked into the very last adventure. But the repercussions of what they do on that last adventure ripple back through the previous ones. So certain events will take place in Return of the Runelords that won't really make much sense at the time, But as the longer you play this game, the more you'll like start figuring out. It's like, oh, we did this in part 5, and that's why this thing in part 2 happened the way it did.
I'm very much looking forward to this. But before we go, I do want to try to talk a little bit about Tyrant's Grasp, only because I personally ran Carrion Crown, and I love that. I love that adventure, especially Richard Pate's adventure, where you defend Frankenstein, which was like genius. That's one of my favorite adventures of all time. It was so much fun. It's like, yes, you have to go to court and defend Frankenstein. It's like, what is going? Like, only Richard writes stuff like that. He's nuts. I love his adventures.
Yeah, Rich's adventures. He has very much. His style is that he really gets into these social situations. He's not as strong when it comes to like just dungeon crawl type elements or the rules themselves, but the imagination he brings to like trials or plays or dinner parties is staggering. And it's not necessarily. And when we build an adventure path, we know this needs to be a Richard Pate adventure because there's something crazy going on in here.
Yeah, you're talking about dinner parties. That dinner party is in Age of Worms, and right, half the stuff is like alive. I know people who ran that adventure path and actually had and made a dinner party and ran the adventure during a dinner party, and they cooked the same things that were on the menu in that adventure.
Oh, that's awesome. He sort of did a spiritual sequel to that dinner party in the third Hell's Rebels adventure, where the players have to go to another crazy dinner party and impress a bunch of high-level NPCs.
Yeah, he is his. Actually, I'm very much looking forward to reading his Return of the Runelords adventure, because I imagine it's up there with craziness.
Oh, absolutely is. It's I don't want to get into it too spoilery, but that his adventure is called Rune Plague. It's the third Return of the Runelords adventure, and the plot there is that the player characters at this point know that the Runelords are coming back, and they've got to go to 4 different locations throughout Varisia and basically fight against the plots of all of these, Runelord stuff going on. So one of them will be pretty much a dungeon crawl, where it's classic, go into the dungeon and explore. One of them is kind of a reverse dungeon crawl, where you're trying to defend a dungeon site. And one of them is basically a big festival, which takes place. It actually takes place in Corvosa during the anniversary of Queen Elios's defeat in Curse of the Crimson Throne. And the player characters have to show someone pretty powerful around the town, give them a good time, and entertain them while they are trying to learn more information about what's going on. And like some of these festival events and things that Rich came up with for that, it's good stuff.
Yeah, and he also wrote, and people talk about it to this day, the Council of Thieves, the play. He wrote the play one where you actually have to put the play on, but they do, quote, the deadly version of the play where people can get hurt and killed during the play. He's I want to meet him or talk to him. I've never met him. I heard he rarely travels and he lives overseas, but I heard he's quite a hoot.
Yeah, he's pretty. We had him out for one of the Paizo cons here, and he's great fun to hang out with.
But anyhow, Tyrant's Grasp. It always upsets me. It's like, oh yeah, that whole adventure path where you were trying to like keep the Whispering Tyrant from breaking out. He broke out anyhow. So give me a little bit, because this is like the big finale for Pathfinder. You're gonna have to go out with a bang and do something nuts. I know you wake up dead. Ron spoiled that on an interview with us. He did tell us you wake up dead.
Yeah, that's not so much a spoiler, because that's like spoiling, Serpent Skull by saying you start shipwrecked, or Skull and Shackles, you start press ganged on a pirate ship. That sets the mood for the entire adventure path, and it's not so much a spoiler as it is a requirement to hook the players into being interested in how it plays out. So with Carrion Crown, the initial idea for Carrion Crown was we wanted to do an adventure path that was basically 6 different classic horror movies. We wanted to do the haunted house, the Frankenstein monster, the Lovecraftian story, the vampire movie, the undead uprising movie, the werewolf movie. And that was the goal of Carrion Crown. It wasn't necessarily to push forward an agenda on the Whispering Tyrant's plot or anything like that. It ended up being the meta story simply because he is such a huge, mover and shaker in Ustalav. But to a certain extent, I've always felt that the Whispering Tyrant being in Ustalav does Ustalav a disservice, because Ustalav is meant to be, this is a place where all of the gothic horror, the classic horror stuff lives. And the Whispering Tyrant is not horror. The Whispering Tyrant is more high fantasy Lord of the Rings type stuff. And so he's undead, but he doesn't really belong there. So with Tyrant's Grasp, we're basically embracing that. He's not so much it's not intended to be a repudiation of the Carrying Crown events as much as it is embracing what his role in the world has always been meant to be. And so for much of Pathfinder's existence, the Whispering Tyrant has been this kind of off-screen, like the Runelords. He's been locked away in his tomb and hasn't really been doing much. And in order for him to basically become a significant threat, he has to get out.
It sounds a little Age of Wormsy, because Age of Worms, you had to go up against Chaos and then kill a god. Does it sound familiar? It sounds like you got to go maybe eventually up against Whispering Tyrant, maybe?
Oh, it's that. I mean, the Tyrant's Grasp adventure is very much about setting up a confrontation with Tar-Bathon. And I don't want to spoil too much. Yeah, I don't know how much I want to spoil because I'm not really working as much on that one.
You don't have to spoil it. Even that, what you said, is good enough. No,
yeah.
Eventually, there'll be a toe-to-toe, mano-a-mano fight.
Yeah.
And that's enough, I think, for most people.
And it's definitely not an end to the story. It's basically setting something up that we want to explore more going forward.
Right, because Pathfinder 2, you're not resetting anything. The story's just going to keep going, correct?
No, absolutely not. I mean, when we went from 3.5 to the Pathfinder rules with between Legacy Fire and Council of Thieves, people were all, worried about, or you're going to do some sort of world-shaking event and change everything. And it's like, no, we're not going to do that. We're not doing that with second edition either. In fact, my goal is for when the edition changes, it should be pretty much invisible to anything in world. So like a wizard who is inside of his house doing wizardly stuff in the day before second edition lines and the day after, he won't notice any difference in how things work. The rules for how his magic works will change, but his role in the world won't change.
So he goes to sleep and it's first edition. He wakes up the next day. It's like, oh, it's second edition. My stuff works a little differently, but it's pretty much the same.
Not even that. He just wakes up and keeps doing what he's doing. Every story we told in first edition needs to be something we can tell in second edition and vice versa.
Cool. And how's that going, by the way? If I may ask, looks like you guys have been very busy compiling lots of feedback and changing and updating the rules quite a bit.
It's I'm on kind of the periphery of that. That's the design team is currently running all of the playtest feedback, all of the heavy lifting there. And what I'm focused on is basically starting getting everything else set for like the adventure paths and the campaign setting stuff and all of the other products that we're going to be working on once the new edition starts up. I've outlined the next adventure path. We haven't announced it yet. I can't announce it yet here, but it's being written by everybody, and it's tricky because the rules aren't done yet. But we have to basically do an entire 6 months of products without a set in stone bunch of rules. So we're using the playtest rules for now and getting ready to change things as it comes along. So it's pretty tricky.
Obviously, that's what happened with Starfinder, and you can see it. Like, we're doing Dead Suns, and like in books 1 and 2, it's definitely, I wouldn't say rough, but you can tell the difference between, say, books 1 and 2 and like 5 and 6, where the rules actually came out and they weren't just like going by the seat of their pants, things like that. Subtle differences.
One thing that I'm already pretty sure of is that when we get to the first adventure path for second edition, I'm probably going to have it set up in a way that rather than the classic earn experience points as you go, I'm probably going to use a milestone setting. So like at certain points as you're playing through, you're going to level up regardless of whether or not you have experience points. So I'm still haven't figured it quite out yet, but that's the problem we ran into with Council of Thieves, because that was the first adventure path we did for Pathfinder. We weren't quite ready. We didn't quite have the complexities of Pathfinder's experience point system worked out yet. As a result, that adventure path only goes up to 13th level. And that was a problem when we got to the last few adventures, because we'd already ordered cover art and we've got monsters on the last few Council of Thieves that were basically they were too high level to use, and we had to come up with creative solutions for that. So it was a tricky trick.
Well, I will tell you from personal experience, who's someone who only runs adventure paths for the last 12 years, and that's all I run. We have abandoned experience points quite a long time ago, and we only use the milestone system. And I think you just do it. You just say, okay, you are now level 2. You're now level 3. It makes things a lot easier. And my guys also, it also almost has like chapters to the story, almost like, well, milestones, like, oh, now, ta-da, that you're going to the next area. And it helps even prepare them knowing, okay, the monsters will be harder, the encounters will be harder. I like the milestone system a lot more than experience points. I haven't used experience points in years.
One of the things I really, really like about experience points is that it gives you something concrete at the end of every session that you can write down in your character sheet, and you can see that, all right, I'm now 23% closer to level. I'm now 48% closer to leveling. With the milestone system, you don't get that. It kind of it's frustrating to me if you play an entire session and your character sheet looks the same as it did when you started the session. And if you level up during a game, of course, you get all sorts of stuff. But it's as a player, I've always valued the seeing like where the experience points progression is going, so I can kind of anticipate. Oh, the next session I'm going to level up, or I'm not going to level up for a couple more sessions, that type of thing. So I don't know. I could see both ways. Certainly, the milestone system is much more elegant when it comes to a narrative-based thing, like a long-term thing, like a campaign setting.
Yeah, no, I'm talking specifically for adventure paths. Well, I kind of do both because I keep their experience points. So I tell them, they don't even ask me. At this point, they don't even ask me. They just say, how close are we? And I'll say 50%, 75%. And same thing, like I don't even give them numbers. I just tell them you're almost there, like another 1 or 2 adventures. So I see what you're saying, and that you almost want to, but I think that's almost in the GM, and that can be handled by just a note here and there, like give them feedback, tell them how they're doing, so they have an idea that they're progressing. I think it can be done, manually, not even through a mechanical system.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's really on the GM to make sure that the player characters are anticipating and they don't like get frustrated because they've been 5 sessions without leveling up.
So I know we're running out of time. Is there anything you want to tell us that to be on the lookout besides Rise of Runelords and Tyrant's Grasp? Any other tidbits coming out in the world of Pathfinder?
Yeah, we just actually yesterday got in the final printed copies of the Sandpoint book that I wrote, and that's coming out in a couple months. And anyone who's been interested in the Sandpoint, which is the town that was introduced in Burnt Offerings, and we've gone back to several times, should absolutely check this book out. I wrote the whole thing and have a whole bunch of long-term secrets and plots and shenanigans revealed in there. Sandpoint doesn't play a big role in Return of the Runelords, but there's a point in the second adventure where you do stop in Sandpoint for one night. And so you could certainly use this book you could use the Sandpoint book to run your own campaign.
No, I know a lot of people love Sandpoint just because it just has a nice little connotation to it. It was the first adventure. It just almost has like that seaside town. It has goblins. It just has like a little bit of everything. Sort of like that sleepy, fun town that's not too powerful, that like little goofy things could happen in it.
Yeah, that was the whole point of it too, is to basically we wanted a place for player characters to want to defend, to protect, to enjoy living in. And you look back at earlier editions of D&D, you got locations like Hamlet, which it's so detailed that people can't help but become involved in it.
I definitely like Sandpoint. It also reminds me, was it of Age of Worms Diamond Lake? Of course, Diamond Lake ends up getting completely destroyed, which is a good motivator to get people moving.
Yeah, Diamond Lake is it's interesting you bring that up, because we always intended to build Diamond Lake up as this terrible, just gross little town. That the point was that you are heroes you're people who lived in Diamond Lake, and you want to leave because it's an awful place to be. And that was intended to be a big part of the motivation of the early part of Age of Worms, was getting enough, experience and money together so that you could escape this awful, awful town. And it kind of ended up happening the reverse, because we put so much detail and work into Diamond Lake that people fell in love with it and they didn't want to leave. And so that was why with Burnt Offerings, we basically took a reverse of that. It's like, let's make a town that everybody wants. It's not a perfect town. There's warts and stuff like in it. It's got some gross history and some evil people living in it. But overall, it's a nice place to live.
Yeah, my characters went into Diamond Lake. I forgot there's like an abandoned house somewhere. They took over the house. They were living there. They loved that place. And then dragons come and burn the whole place down and destroy everything, which actually really good motivation for them to go then kill the bad guys, because their house got burned down.
Yeah. That's a tricky thing to do, is you don't want to just use like box text to take away everything the player characters have, but you do want to, motivate them. So it's kind of a balancing act.
Yeah, well, they didn't really lose anything. It was just the house. But still, it's funny because even to this day, I remember that because they were so upset. They're like, oh, our house is gone. What happened to our house? Thank you so much, James. We got to talk about everything, the whole history of D&D and Pathfinder and everything you've ever worked on. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, this is great.
All right. Thanks a lot, James. Hey, everyone. Steve here. Hope you guys enjoyed that interview. I could probably talk to James for hours upon hours since he's been in this industry for 30 years. I'm definitely going to have him on the show again, and we will just talk about all things Pathfinder and D&D related since he has seen it all. One thing I do want to note, if you want, you can easily find Dungeon Magazine number 12 on the internets, and I would strongly suggest you find it because his first adventure is there, and it's actually pretty cool. It's a choose-your-own adventure where you play a 12th level fighter. And the funniest thing is the little blurb. It says, James Jacobs lives in the town of Point Arena in the Northern California coast, where he is a sophomore in high school. He got involved in gaming in the 5th grade and is now a dungeon master. In his spare time, James enjoys both reading and writing horror stories, as well as drawing. I love how it was almost like a thing back then to become a dungeon master. It was like getting a black belt back then. It's like, oh, you are a dungeon master? Cool. But yes, I strongly suggest you just hunt the internets. Just type in Dungeon Magazine number 12. It comes up pretty quickly. And yeah, check it out. James's adventure actually still holds up to this day. You don't actually have to play it as a, 12th level fighter and fight everything, but it has a choose your own adventure mechanism where you actually, have to select what you want to do, and then you turn to that section. And it's pretty good, especially considering he wrote it 30 years ago when he was a sophomore in high school. I think this James guy might be going somewhere. Anyhow, if you're new to the Roll for Combat podcast, do check us out on Discord. We got a lot going on there. You can just go to discord.rollforcombat.com. We actually play a lot of games of Pathfinder and Starfinder. Also, do check out our main podcast where we're going through the Dead Sons Adventure Path. And if you like interviews with people from Paizo and other members of the role-playing community, do subscribe to our podcast. We are going to have a couple of more coming up very soon. We have several already in the can, and look for another interview from another person from Paizo next week. Anyhow, thanks for listening, and I'll see you guys next week.
You've been listening to Roll for Combat, a Starfinder actual play podcast. If you have a question or comment for the show, please visit us at rollforcombat.com or drop us a line at contact@rollforcombat.com. You can also find us on Twitter, Facebook, Discord, and other social media platforms. You've been listening to Roll for Combat. Until next week, always remember that strange women lying in ponds distributing swords is no basis for a system of government.